Hi, I'm Penny. Last year for the Rochester Fringe Festival, I wrote and produced a show called Spy in the House of Men. It was a story of my life, and it was really well received. Everyone who saw it said everyone should see it. So this past summer, I took my show on the road to Ithaca, Cincinnati, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, and then back here in Rochester. And I plan on continuing to do it in the future as much as I can. After so many years of living in hiding, the positive response I received from my show was amazing, unexpected, and validating. But one thing I really didn't talk about in my show was the title, Spy in the House of Men. What does that mean? How am I a spy? So, in the spirit of revealing the invisible, I called my show Spy in the House of Men because I applied for it before I actually wrote anything for the festival, and I had to have some sort of title in the application, and it was such a cool one. And you know, I got in the newspaper, and it was on all the festival programming, and even on my stationery. So I figured just go with it. I really did plan on talking about it during the show, by the way, but you know, I had all this backstory I had to do about my life growing up, and then there was a really cool story about me admitting that I was transgender and transitioning when I was 55, and then all the interesting things that happened to me since then. So by the time I wrote all that, I was already close to an hour, so I just kind of glossed over the subject with a sentence or two, and nobody really seemed to notice. Besides, those stories really weren't all that entertaining. Kind of dark, really. Well, there was darkness in the stories I told, to be sure, but in those stories, I wasn't the bad guy. And I wasn't the bad guy much during that 40-year period. In fact, I think I was rather a good guy. I helped people move. I bought pitchers of beer sometimes when it wasn't even my turn. I told funny stories. I held a steady job. I loved my wife and kids, all that stuff. In fact, the bulk of who I am now is pretty much identical to who I was back then, except, not nearly as much beer. I'm just doing things better and more joyfully and without that big fundamental lie about who I am. And it's in that lie that we find the darkness. And as much as I would love to take all of the things that require content warning and say, oh, that was Brian, and then take all the good stuff and say, this is Penny, I can't. It's all me. And I think it's really important that I talk about this right now, especially with so many stories of men in the news, powerful men sexually abusing people, and with so many of my friends posting on Facebook almost on a daily basis about how these random men just casually objectify and terrorize them just for being women in public. Because I've dealt with that too, which quite frankly surprises the hell out of me. I mean, look at me. I'm 58 years old. I'm built like your dad, and I dress like your mom. But in the past 3 years, I have been propositioned, threatened, and assaulted, both verbally and physically, more than a half a dozen times. Yay, I'm in the club. The thing is, I'm in the other club, too. The one that uses size and strength and words and fear to get what they want from others. I wish to God I wasn't, but I am. It was a big part of who I was as a man. And I know that I'm using euphemisms like in the club because this is an awful subject and it does require content warnings because I'm talking about abuse from the perspective of the abuser. It is hard to talk about, and I can understand how hard it can be to hear. So please bear with me as I try to tell my story as openly and as honestly as I can with nothing added and with nothing taken away. And please understand that this is such a complicated subject for anybody to talk about, especially for somebody like me. I have always been transgender. Always. I was transgender since before transgender was even a word. Since before I even knew it was a concept. Something was different about me. But I didn't know what I was until I was 8 years old, and I didn't know that anybody else in the world was like me until I was 16. And that was when Renee Richards, an eye doctor who had a sex change operation, as it was called back then, made headlines for competing in the women's professional tennis circuit. And the reaction to her in the small, wealthy, isolated little town where I grew up was pretty uniformly negative. A lot of crude jokes, mostly. Many of them invoking Title IX, the federal amendment that made it illegal to discriminate based upon sex, that had just recently been signed into law and was equally ridiculed, mocked, and resented. But by this time, I had already made the decision that I was never ever going to tell anybody who I was ever. I had decided that this was going to be a secret that would be buried with me, and everything that I saw simply reinforced that decision. So, I set about the business of hiding myself and trying to fit in, and hoping against hope that I could somehow kill that part of my soul that kept screaming at me, "This is not who I am." And although I never did manage to kill it, obviously, I was able to starve it of enough oxygen that it kept pretty quiet. I called my show Spy in the House of Men because that's what I was. I was alone in a world that wanted me to be a man, and I wanted to be one, but I wasn't, and there was nobody to talk to about this, so I had to do this by myself. I had no mentor to guide me or coach me, partially for reasons beyond my control, but also because I was terrified of getting close to anybody because they would find out that I was a fraud. So I did that. And I did it by myself because that was a good thing, because self-reliance is a very manly trait to have. Actually, everything I learned about being a man, I learned by observing and imitating other men. And I mean everything, right down to the way I walked, because my dad told me that I walked like a girl. By the way, you have no idea how great it is to be able to use my hips when I walk now. My entire lower back keeps on saying, "Oh, thank God." The world I observed was run by men, and these men didn't much tolerate women encroaching into their territory. Men were men, and women were women, and we all had our own spaces, and any hint of gender variance was either done as a joke or treated like one. This was the world I observed at home, where my father got everything that he wanted without question, and my mother willingly went along with it. This is the world I observed at my school, where the older boys bullied the younger ones, and the assholes got all the cute girls. So when I got older, I figured I was supposed to be the one to bully, and I did. The girlfriend thing, not so much. And it was the world I observed on television, my greatest teacher, that taught me that women were to be pursued and controlled and were prizes to be captured. And even if they protested and struggled, they liked it, and they wanted it to be that way. And to be honest, nothing I saw in the world around me contested that view. I was a man. And that meant that I could get what I want if I was forceful enough. And I was bigger than many and stronger than most and stupid enough to think that this was a good idea. And if ever I came across a woman who had a problem with this, well, it was just because she wasn't reading the script and I had a solution for it. It was called abuse. I was an abuser of women. Some that I knew and some that I barely knew. Every time I say those words, which isn't often because I don't want to say them at all, I want to throw caveats into it. Some of it was when I was young and just learning to explore my sexuality. Some of it was when I was drunk. Some of it may even have been welcome, but then again, I thought all of it was welcomed. Most of it was just in my arrogance and the way I objectified and belittled women. Most of it was not really physical or even violent until I got married. And then it was, just words. Sometimes my words really loud, and my size, of course, so that was like just a hint of violence. Mostly just a hint. Just enough physical stuff. Isn't that a great way to put it? Physical stuff? I could be talking about an Olivia Newton-John music video. Just enough pushing and grabbing and holding and hitting that I could get what I wanted with just a word. Sometimes with just a look. Worked on the kids too. So that's not really abuse, right? I mean, I didn't hit them much. It's certainly less than I got hit as a kid, so that's better, right? Right? No. No, that's not right. Abuse is abuse is abuse, and terror is no better than violence, and in some ways it is worse, because it's harder to prove, and it can be justified, and if I can justify it, I can just keep right on doing it. So I did that, and I was ashamed of myself for doing it. After a while, I got so ashamed that I got into therapy, and that's where I learned about toxic masculinity. And I discovered that the life that I was living, the one that I learned by watching and imitating other men, was toxic. And with my therapist's help, I was able to admit that I was an abuser, and I began moving away from that behavior. And that was so hard, because it was so ingrained in me that I defaulted to it. My therapist told me that something like 99% of spousal abusers never get treatment. And of those that do, 99% of them never admit that they're abusers. And my therapist didn't say this part, but I have to believe that of the ones who admit that they're abusers, 99% of them would never get up on stage and talk about it. And of those people, none of them dress better than me, so how lucky are you guys? So that took care of the big, obvious, fairly undeniable forms of abuse. Admitting that I'm an abuser is hard, because every time I do, I break my heart. I had people who loved me, who cared for me, who needed me and admired me, and I abused them emotionally and physically. And I will spend the rest of my life making amends for that behavior. At least that's my hope. I don't ever want anyone to be afraid of me ever again. I can't say enough about getting your heart broken, by the way. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that we can receive. I'm not talking about the romantic heartbreak stuff, that romantic heartbreak is, star-crossed lovers and scorned advances and longing gazes over windswept heaths and stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the breaking of the hardened heart. The heart with the thick, defensive crust covering the true, tender center of the soul. The kind of heartbreak I experienced when I could not stand hating everybody and everything, including myself, especially myself, for 1 second more. And I found myself weeping and saying things like, "Oh my God, I am such an asshole." And I found people who said, "Yes, I know, and I love you anyway." And eventually one of the people that said that to me was me. And that's when I let go of the toxic and toxic masculinity, which meant that I could listen when someone told me that something that I was doing that I thought was perfectly okay was not. And so I could learn from that and change my behavior and make amends for that as well. And then I could see that behavior in others, and I could learn to say to them, "No, that is not okay," even if the behavior they were doing was not negatively affecting me because it was hurting somebody else. And that was how I healed my broken heart. And I discovered that my mended heart was stronger, more resilient, and just plain better than my crusty old hardened heart. And I discovered that I am only as sick as my secrets. And that's when I realized I needed to get rid of more than just the toxic part of toxic masculinity. And that is how I became the spy who came in from the testosterone or something. The metaphor really breaks down at this point. The hardest thing about talking like this is right-sizing my behavior. On one hand, I don't want to minimize or defend anything I did, but on the other hand, I am aware that the words I use prompt such negative reactions in some people that I'm afraid that I will be shunned and ostracized for talking about it, and I'm still afraid of that. But I don't know of any other way of talking about this. I may have a broader definition of what constitutes abuse than the popular one, and certainly not the legal one. I can and did defend my behavior. And that's kind of the point. If the stigma of admitting an unacceptable behavior is so great that it is safer to continue the behavior than to work at changing it, we're never going to grow as a society. You may have also noticed that I never actually mentioned any of the abuse that I did, and that was deliberate. I didn't want any time or energy spent wondering if what I was talking about actually was abuse, or if you're thinking that it's some sort of yardstick to measure some behavior of yours against. If you are wondering if you might be abusive, please continue wondering. And maybe talk to somebody about it. Probably not your partner, because there's a chance you won't get an honest answer from them. And by the way, men are not the only abusers in our society, not by a long shot. If you're looking for some sort of yardstick, you can always use the one that I use. I believe that the proper use of power in any interpersonal relationship is to first make things safe for the person with less power. Not to rescue, or to save, or to correct, or to punish. That might be part of it, but safety first. Are you being safe? Do you feel safe? Whatever you do, whether anything I said here is of value or not, please be gentle with yourselves and with others. We're all just doing the best we can. Thank you.